Welcome back to another week of Wake Up Call. Thanks for being here. I'm going to dive into your questions. Bruce asked a great question. He said, "Thanks, Kristen. One question that I have is, who had the capability of creating the Saturn-Moon matrix in this dimension? Who had the capability of creating the moon and then placing it where it is? The archons cannot function in this dimension, and the idea that their stooges had the capability of doing that at one time is mind-blowing. Why don't we ever find anything that indicates that level of technological advancement?" So I don't know if I have the exact right answer, but this is just what I personally believe. I believe that the archons, the watchers, the interdimensional beings that are pulling energy from us were once able to shift into this world much easier. If you go back in time to before the flood, when the Anunnaki were supposedly here, I think that those beings that are in control of the planets were actually in physical on Earth. And now they're no longer able to do that. So they have to control it from outside of this dimension. So if I had to guess, the planets are actually the fallen beings themselves. And you ask about, why don't we ever find anything that indicates that level of technological advancement? Now, I know with the moon's size, it's hard to fathom how they could do that. But if you think to, CERN nowadays, I think that that's an indication of a certain type of technology that opens portals into other dimensions. And I think a lot of the black magic that these controllers on our planet are doing, it all has to do with bringing these archonic Anunnaki back into the physical. I hope that makes sense. I think that's what's happening, just from my research, but I know it's definitely hard to fathom, these archons and this consciousness actually being a planet of that size. But I think that's what's happening. So I hope I answered that. And Dig asked, "Thank you for the insights. May I ask about the other 5 chakras above the body? I read about them in Bringers of the Dawn by Barbara Marciniak, Chapter 2. Did not think much of it myself, since we keep hearing only about the 7, but now I wonder if others know about it and have theirs activated." So this sort of ties into Bruce's question, and if you bring a Gnostic element into this, it all starts to make sense. So what I explained about the 7 chakras and the other 5 that you want to talk about, they correspond with the 7 main planets and the 7 main archons. And so if your chakras are not properly activated, then these archons are feeding off of your energy within the body and within your chakras. So it's thought that Yaldabaoth is the first archon, the demiurge, and the one that corresponds to Saturn, and the other 6 came from this entity. So Saturn technically created the other planets, which brings it back to Bruce's question. Io, the second, corresponds to Jupiter, and these all have different names within different religions, even going way further back than Gnosticism. Sabaoth, the third, corresponds to Mars, and he dethrones his father, Yaldabaoth. And that's what I think a lot of this Middle Eastern stuff is about, which we're going to get into this episode. And, Elon Musk talking about we're going to Mars. I think a lot of it has to do with this, actually. Astaphios, the fourth, corresponds to Venus, which also has plenty of other names. Adonis, the fifth, corresponds to the sun. Aeolus, the sixth, corresponds to Mercury. Horios, the seventh, corresponds to the moon. So, so as far as what the other 5 planets do in the chakra system, I will pull up the photo that I shared from last week. But above the root chakra, which is Saturn, is sex, and it's creative energy too. Anything, it's thought that a lot of creative people have orange auras. I've never seen mine. I used to be able to see other people's auras for like a few months. It was really weird. I was able to not see everybody's, but it would just kind of like pop up out of nowhere. I can't see them anymore. I don't know why, but I've been told that I have like an orangey gold aura, and it probably has something to do with creativity. I would consider myself a creative person. So, but it's also linked to sex, and Jupiter is the ruler of that. Then above that is the navel, and Mars, which is associated with Aries and Scorpio, is the navel. The heart is obviously Venus. Doesn't that make sense? Taurus and Libra. And the throat, which is communication, is Mercury. So you can see how this all makes sense. It's like, duh, I mean, it makes total sense. And then the 5th planet that we didn't talk about much was the sun, which is also connected to the third eye, which I talked about with the moon, and me sort of going back and forth about, well, is the sun like the true light and the moon is the false light? They're both seen as third eye planets. And last but not least, I'm going to answer Christopher's question. What is your take on the effects of our imagination on the world or realms around us? Do you believe that even in the mundanity of a simple dreaming idea that we can affect and shape the world, maybe even naively in a negative sense or naively in a positive one? Yeah, I do. And I think that there's actually, it goes beyond just the negative or the naive aspects. I think you can take a positive naive path, which is delusion, right? So that's not based in truth, which isn't going to necessarily lead anywhere good. You can take the negative naive path, which is self-destruction. You can take the positive path of wisdom, which is what makes the world a better place and makes your own world a better place. And that's what everybody should be moving towards, is because if you're a positive person without knowledge, I've said it before, it's not going to make a huge difference. If you are on the positive path from a place of wisdom, speaking the truth, that has a much more powerful effect. And then the controllers of this world take the negative path of wisdom, right? Which is what the dark occult does. And they are manipulating and controlling us, but it's actually not as powerful as the positive path of wisdom. So absolutely, I think that our energy can affect and shape the world. It's just that we need enough people doing that, I think. And who knows, maybe we do have enough. We're constantly trying to figure that out, right? And Rose, I love your dream that you had. That's awesome. This week, I sat with myself and I was like, what are these wars in the Middle East really about? And I did an episode on the Stargate technology and what I think Stargates really are and that they do exist. And seeing a lot of other people starting to talk about that as well. But I don't think that that's just the extent of it. I think that these places in the Middle East have very occult energies, and it's blood sacrifice being done to summon these energies, these archons, whatever. But not only that, it's also because these occultists are obsessed with duality and from dark to light and problem, reaction, solution and order out of chaos. So I've been talking about, in a number of different ways, an incoming one world religion. And I've talked about how I think the Catholic Church is going to play into that. But ultimately, the catalyst to bring about unity is going to be between the Muslims and the Jews. And if you go back in time, before Abrahamic religions and before monotheism, you get paganism, right? And so a lot of people say, well, the Abrahamic religions are based in pagan beliefs, actually, you know, with the holidays and all that stuff. But there was a monotheistic religion out of Persia, aka Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, these countries that we've been at war with or conflict with. And they believed in a religion called Zoroastrianism. And this was actually the first monotheistic religion, even before Judaism. The Jews at that time were still polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. So there's also a debate with Zoroastrianism that it's not monotheistic, that it does believe in multiple gods, but it still believes in one main creator. So all of the Abrahamic religions that believe in one God, this is where it came from, and it came from Iran. And what do you think is going to happen when all of these people are starting to awaken, all of these people are starting to ascend, seeing what's going on with the Abrahamic religions, seeing what's going on in the Middle East, getting sick of it? They're going to go back in time and say, oh, wow, you know, this is where this all came from. So my theory is that once the dust settles, whenever that is, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, my guess is sooner rather than later, they're going to move towards this one world religion based in Zoroastrianism. They might call it something different, but the cult that runs the world that is hiding behind Judaism at the moment, they eventually will need to go like in hiding or underground, so to speak, because the world is getting sick of it. But they're still going to have their quote unquote Zionist control through what I think will happen with the joining of these religions. So today we're going to dive deep into what Zoroastrianism was. And this is all a little bit new to me too, so bear with me. I'm going to take some talking points from a website called symbolsage.com and Zoroastrianism and the influence in the West. So, we're often told that Judaism was the first monotheistic religion in the world, which is sort of correct, but not quite. It doesn't tell the whole story. The prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, spoke against this polytheistic religion and spread the idea that there is only one God. Ahura Mazda was the name of this god, the Lord of Wisdom. Ahura meaning Lord and Mazda meaning wisdom. Yes, Mazda, the car company, is named after this. It took several centuries after Zarathustra's death for Zoroastrianism to become a fully shaped religion, which is why it's often said that Zoroastrianism began in the 6th century BC. That's what, like, if you Google this stuff, that's what it'll say. But actually, it goes back to possibly as far back as like 4000 BC. Zoroastrianism is all about the worship of one God, who represents wisdom. The religion also introduced the concepts of dualism, depicting the eternal battle between the forces of good and evil. Good is represented by the spirit Spenta Mayangu, and evil is symbolized by Angra Mayangu, both which are under Ahura Mazda. So here's where, you get the other deities coming in. This dualistic worldview is the basis for the fundamental ethical principle of Zoroastrianism, the constant battle between good and evil. Those who practice the faith are encouraged to be active participants in this battle, choosing the path of righteousness or Asha over the path of falsehood or Doro. Followers are taught that they have the power and responsibility to choose between good and evil in their thoughts, words, and deeds, a trio of principles often summarized as good thoughts, good words, good deeds. You can choose your path, but there will be consequences for your choices. This brings us to Zoroastrian eschatology, which was unique for its time. Eschatology is defined as the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul of humankind. So this savior figure judgment theme, it comes from Zoroastrianism. It doesn't come from Judaism, okay? This is where it comes from. In Zoroastrianism, this includes the belief of a future savior, a final judgment, and the eventual triumph of good over evil. After death, an individual's soul is judged based on their life deeds, with the virtuous granted a place in heaven and the wicked condemned to hell. It's also interesting that they worship fire. An important note is that Zoroastrians are often called fire worshippers, but this is a misunderstanding of their religious practices. In Zoroastrianism, fire isn't worshipped as a god, but rather revered as a physical representation or symbol of the divine, specifically the wisdom of Ahura Mazda. Fire serves as a medium through which spiritual insight and wisdom are gained. In Zoroastrian fire temples, a sacred fire is kept continuously burning by the priests, representing the eternal presence of Ahura Mazda, righteousness, and truth. The fire is also a symbol of cosmic order and the light of wisdom that drives away the darkness of chaos and ignorance. So when we hear these biblical references of the world ending in fire, could this be a reference to the end times, end of an age where humanity awakens with wisdom, not literal fire? I would guess yes, that's what it actually means. Who knows though? So how is Zoroastrianism connected to Judaism? This is where it gets interesting. This is where we're going to connect some dots to see what is really happening between Israel and Iran right now, and how it probably has something to do with this stuff. So the connection to Judaism. Most scholars agree that the first and main point of contact was between Zoroastrianism and the ancient Jewish people in Babylon. The latter had just been liberated by the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, and were starting to interact with many of the followers of Zarathustra. It's believed that those interactions had started even before the conquest. As a result, many of the concepts of Zoroastrianism started making their way through Jewish society and beliefs. That's when the concept of Satan appeared in Jewish thought, as it wasn't part of the older Hebrew writings. So, when we talk about Yahweh being actually Satan, this is because it's like, okay, well, is Yahweh Satan, or is Satan Satan, or are they same people? Like, why would they be making one sound better than the other? This is where this comes in, because I think the Jews saw Yahweh as just an all-powerful being, maybe not purely negative or purely positive. But then the concept of Satan came in, and now you have both. And it's like, well, what's what. This is where it starts to be like, okay, now this is starting to make sense. So which is older, Judaism or Zoroastrianism? You might be wondering, isn't Judaism older than Zoroastrianism and therefore the oldest monotheistic religion? Yes and no. Judaism is technically considered the oldest monotheistic religion in the world, as the earliest Hebrew scriptures date back to as far as 4000 BCE, or 6,000 years ago. This is several millennia older than Zoroastrianism, but then there were Greek philosophers who actually said Zoroastrianism was actually older. But here's the but. Early Judaism wasn't monotheistic, like I said. The earliest beliefs of the Israelites were categorically polytheistic. It took thousands of years for those beliefs to eventually become more henotheistic being the worship of one God among a pantheon of other real gods, then monolatristic, monolatry being the worship of one God against the pantheon of other real but evil gods worshipped by other societies. It wasn't until the 6th to 7th century that Judaism started becoming monotheistic and the Israelites began to believe in their one true God and viewing other gods as not real gods. So, sorry guys, the first monotheistic religion was Zoroastrianism and not Judaism. So, influence on Greek culture. One lesser known interaction between Zoroastrianism and European cultures occurred in Greece. As the conquest of the Persian Empire eventually reached the Balkans and Greece, the concept of free will made its way there too. For reference, the first comprehensive and militaristic contact between the two societies was in 507 BCE, but there were minor non-militaristic contacts and trade before that as well. So, next up, I'm going to get into the Khazarian link, because these Zoroastrians were all linked up into the trade stuff, and here's where we have the bleeding over of Zoroastrianism into Khazarians, and this stuff is not really talked about. It's so interesting. So I know I'm reading a lot, but this is new information to me. I'm sure it's going to be new information to a lot of you too, and if it's not, good on you for knowing this stuff. So, according to the ancient Greco-Roman religions, everyone's fate had already been written and people had little actual agency. Instead, they just played the parts that were given by the fates, and that was that. So, they didn't really believe free will in free will until Zoroastrianism came in. So here's another influence. Like, we hear in Christianity a lot about free will and God gives you free will. Zoroastrianism, that's where it came from. However, there was a noticeable shift toward the concept of free will in Greek philosophy after the two societies began increasingly interacting. Granted, when talking about Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions, the question of free will is still vehemently debated, as these religions also believe that the future has already been written. And I actually personally believe in both too. I believe that there's fate and destiny, and they're not exactly the same things. That your destiny in the world is sort of already planned, like the general theme of what your life is going to be, but your fate, you kind of have control over that. As a result, opponents claim that the idea of free will in Christianity or in other Abrahamic religions is an oxymoron or contradictory. I think it's just both. But putting that debate aside, it's widely accepted that Zoroastrianism was the religion that introduced the concept of free will into Judaism, Christianity, Greek philosophy, and the West as a whole. Fun fact, Freddie Mercury was a Zoroastrian. There are very few left in the world today. I think the number is like 200,000 or something like that. It's not many, but apparently in Iran, it's making a resurgence amongst young city dweller, more progressive-minded people are taking an interest in it again. And don't be surprised if it starts to gain popularity. Maybe it'll transform into another faith, another name. But these themes, I think, are going to be the catalyst for, I think of the coexist stickers on the bumpers where, that in theory, that is nice. And I do believe that all different races and religions should interact with one another peacefully, but it's that order out of chaos thing. And if they're going to bring about peace, they're going to say, oh, well, we have to go back to our roots. It's the perfect excuse to usher in a one world, new world religion, new age religion. So let's show the clip of Jordan Maxwell talking about this. I actually never heard him talk about Zoroastrianism, and it just so happened that I know I share a lot of his work, and I am a big fan of his, and don't mean to be repetitive, but I caught this. I was like, oh, interesting. He even talked about it. Then I'm also going to show you a clip of how Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and the Abrahamic religions all overlapped. So let's watch those.
One of the most important influences on Judaism in the world today is Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism comes from Iraq. Iraq is the home of Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastrianism dominates Judaism. Almost all the teachings in Judaism come from Zoroastrianism in Iraq. I think it's awful interesting that today Iraq is now being plundered under. I wonder why. All of the teachings in Judaism can be traced back to Iraq. That's very interesting in my opinion. In the King's Old English, J-E-W was Jew was spelled I-U. And incidentally, pater. This is another interesting word, pater, P-A-T-E-R. Pater is an old Phoenician name for our word for God, or for Father, for the Father God, pater.
Zoroastrianism, a bridge between Hinduism and Abrahamic faiths. The ancient religions of present-day Iran once included many beliefs which were similar to the Aryan Vedic religions of India. For example, major deities there included Ahura Mazda, similar to Varuna Dev as the wise lord of the sky. Mithra, deity of light, oaths, justice, friendship and the sun, was known in India as Mitra. Uttar, the deity of fire, was similar to Agni. And feminine deities like Spenta Aramati is equivalent to the Rigvedic Aramati. The worshipped included various food offerings which were similar to the Vedic. Notably, the ancient Iranian conception of the universe was strikingly similar to India's Puranic cosmology. Now, on to the saint Zarathustra. Some say he was born around 1500 BCE in northeast Iran, an area where the Vedic system was not fully in place, and at that time there was much turbulence in the region. It is said that Zarathustra received a revelation while collecting water for a ritual. A divine figure appeared, who led him to whom he identified as Ahura Mazda. That great being explained that he was the supreme god. Some Hindus might suggest that he saw Lord Vishnu seated on Garuda, which does seem similar to Ahura Mazda. Zarathustra had spent 10 years living in the mountains as an ascetic. When he emerged, he began preaching with vigor. Now, the Bhavishya Puran and the Rig Veda describe a relevant story. The venerable sage Vashishta and Jarasabda or Jaratha were priests of Varuna Dev. However, a rivalry broke out between them. As a result, Jaratha preached something different to Vedic culture. For that, he was cursed to leave Bharatvash. Some claim that Jaratha became known there as Zarathustra, possibly in his following life. Anyway, From this single man, the new religion of Zoroastrianism gradually took shape. By the beginning of the 10th century BCE, the previous Iranian religions were phasing out, and by 600 BCE, Zoroastrianism had become the state religion. Around 200 years after that, the warlike Achaemenid kings made it a policy to destroy the shrines of the deities, smaller gods, and vilify them. It is doubtful, however, whether the peaceful Zarathustra would have approved of such tactics. A Satan-like figure called Angra was a unique figure in Zoroastrianism. The former belief in reincarnation was replaced with a focus on an eternal heaven and hell, judgment, and the apocalypse. Murtis, images, were replaced by worshipping Ahura Mazda in the form of fire. Zoroastrianism is monotheistic, but adherents did believe in Yajatas, a similar concept to angels. So, the faith is almost like a historical bridge between the Indic and Abrahamic traditions, and also Greek thought. Despite all that, the Zoroastrian system itself remains similar to the Vedic one. For example, Zarathustra compiled the Gathas, which include Vedic verses, and was a vegetarian.
Now, one question that I have is, with this monotheistic view, were they actually worshiping the real God of the multiverse, or were they worshiping the inverted little g God of the universe? And I kind of would guess the latter, only based on they still practice sacrifices and stuff to the gods. And there was a class of priests and stuff. So that in and of itself tells me that if there were sacrifices happening, even if it was just to one god, then that's not a good sign. That's not a good sign that this religion is based in connection to the ultimate divine creator. But I could be wrong. Maybe it was just bleeding in from the pagan stuff and they didn't know any, but I don't know, but I would guess that this whole concept of an all-powerful, bloodthirsty God actually comes from Zoroastrianism and the concept of Satan and stuff too. So here's where it gets a little tricky, and it's actually hard to find information on this, but this religion is linked to the Khazars, and not all of the Khazars were Zoroastrian, but likely a lot of them were, because Khazars, if you study the history, are from parts of Iran and Turkey. So the Khazars had a history of hiding behind all different religions, Zoroastrianism being one of them. So what a lot of them seem to have done, from my research, is they mixed Zoroastrianism with shamanism, which is now known as Kabbalah. And they likely became Zoroastrian not out of religious, spiritual reasons, but out of trade reasons. Yet again, before converting to Judaism. Now, mainstream history is not going to link the Zoroastrians to the Khazars. You have to dig deep and really look for it, but it's there. And it's almost impossible for that not to have happened, just because of the popularity of Zoroastrianism at that time. I think I'll go into the numbers, but I think it was over 30 million people at that time who were Zoroastrians, and it spread all the way to the east, all the way to Russia, all the way to China. This religion spread all over the place, and then it's spread to Prussia, which is modern day Germany. So what happened was, it seems that the most powerful Khazars were hiding behind Zoroastrianism. Then they migrated to parts of Europe, like Prussia, married into the richest families, and the Khazars hold Persian DNA. So all this stuff going on with Iran is interesting, because we say that the Khazars are Jewish, but they actually have Persian ties too. So now we're getting all this overlap, right? So some of the Khazarians who moved to Prussia took the Zoroastrianism with them, and they likely butchered it and changed it with their shamanistic philosophies. So then it changed, and then they had to hide behind the Jews. And the Bible making God's chosen people as the Jews, it's likely that these Khazarian Zoroastrians may have been the ones that said that, and that's where that kind of shifted, which we'll get into a little bit. The Iranian-Prussian dynasty was short-lived after they lost the war to the Russians. Instead of ruling countries, they began creating secret societies and marrying into all of Europe's richest families, so they could gain control and power again. From the Egyptians to the Iranians, etc., all connected to Cain. So if you study these bloodlines, it all goes back to Cain, as in Cain and Abel. They have a pattern. They rule, they piss people off, then they go underground, and then they rule again. So what's happening in the Middle East? People are getting pissed off with Israel. What's going to happen? They're probably going to go underground. Underground bunkers, anyone? Maybe, a cataclysm is not going to happen, but there's going to be a lot of fucking pissed off people. And maybe they're afraid of that. Maybe this is much, much more simple than we're making it out to be, actually. But they're not going to want to let go of their control. So then they're going to have to conduct power from the hidden, even more hidden, and make it look like there's going to be peace between Muslims and Jews. Mark my words. Maybe, I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime. I think I will. So the two main areas that this group infiltrated was Germany, eventually became the Nazis, and Italy, the Vatican. The Catholic Church has been under their control since 1100 AD. See my episode on the Catholic Church, and I talk about the black and the gray and the white pope and stuff, and it's all connected back to this stuff. They were in control of the Knights Templar. It's said that hundreds of years ago, the Knights Templar went to the Temple Mount, found King Solomon's tomb, and found the manuscripts that teach you how to control the demons to do your will. So the Catholic Church was in possession of this. And then the Orsinis, who I've talked about on a previous episode, caught wind of it. And by 1500, they got their own pope and to have this knowledge and continue to control to this day, which I've discussed before. But you can see how it's not just the Jews, and it's not just, it's actually, I always say it's an ancient Babylonian cult, but it's actually even more than that, because when you start combining the Babylonian cult with this Zoroastrian thing and the influence that it had on Abrahamic religions, it all really starts to make a lot of sense. So I mentioned something about the Zoroastrian Khazars kind of coming up with the idea that they're God's chosen people because they started hiding behind Judaism. And there was a Rabbi, Rav Ashi, who is said to be the writer of the Talmud, he was likely Zoroastrian, and his name is even Zoroastrian. His last name, Ashi, was a village in Iran meaning reward or that which is attained. But apparently his work was written in heavy biblical language during the medieval period. So that was all tampered with too. I mean, we can't take these historic texts literally because of this, they've been tampered with. Zoroastrianism dates back to 6000 BC, according to Greek scholars like Exodus and Plutarch. Eutychus is the name, and Plutarch. Although modern scholars date it back to around 2000 BC. So we're talking about a religion that's possibly up to 8,000 years old. The Golden Age. Here we go again with the Golden Age. During Zoroastrian's, popularity, that was during the Golden Age. That was referred to as the Golden Age at around 300 BC, and over 30 million practiced at the time. So when you hear that, are they talking about Zoroastrianism? Possibly. And just a side note, Zoroastrianism was studied by Aleister Crowley, Madame Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, and a lot of other occultists throughout time. So, we talk about Kabbalah, we talk about the Sabbatean Frankists, we talk about the Illuminati and the Knights Templar and stuff, but do we ever talk about Zoroastrianism? I don't hear a lot of people talking about it, but it's influenced so much of our world today, and so many of the religions and philosophies that we see playing out, and even the dark occultists' obsession with duality goes back to this Zoroastrian theme of good versus evil. Seems simple, right? But this is where it all came from, because prior to Zoroastrianism, they didn't the concept of free will and good versus evil was not really a thing. It was just there's a hierarchy and a power structure, and this is just the way the world is, before these philosophies came into play. So Zoroastrianism was one of the biggest change-making movements of this entire world, and it's so rarely talked about. And when we watch what's happening in the Middle East, I think it's important to go back to this, even if I'm dead wrong about my theory on these elements and blending of religions, of the Abrahamic religions. Even if I'm wrong about this, going back and doing the research on Zoroastrianism is really beneficial, and I hope that you learned something. So next week I'll be here, but the following week, let's look at the calendar. So next week I will be doing an episode on the 27th, but then on the 4th of July I will be out that week, and possibly that following week as well. So I will try to make next week's episode a little extra long for you, because you might not see me for a week or two after. Hope you enjoyed it, and much love to you all. I'll see you soon.